You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're going back to episode 459, exactly 2 years ago, to chat with Ben Goldfarb about his book, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. We discuss how roads cut off ecosystems, wildlife crossings, and animal mobility at different scales. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, stupendous Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city aficionados and transportation savants, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month could get you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you just want to give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get a podcast feed with 0 outside ads or podcasts. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it. We've also got some bonus material up there, and we'll be posting more soon, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight knit bike scarf is back in stock, and of course, it's getting cold out, so you need one. For you, for your friends, your colleagues, or for the anti-bus activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you want to support the show in other ways, you can buy books from the authors we've chatted with on the podcast at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com, and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, or you can just keep listening and enjoy the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect. Usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. Okay, so we are going back in time to episode 459, and exactly 2 years ago, literally on 11/30/2023, we released this episode with Ben Goldfarb. I really wanted to get this episode out because of the folks from the War on Cars, Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear, actually shared a bit of this work in their book that they just released, and we talked about it on the show a couple weeks ago. And so I wanted to put this podcast out just to share this, this interview that we did with Ben, who they talked about a fair amount in the book. And so another thing is that I totally missed Thursday's podcast episode. It was supposed to be a replay anyways, but I didn't get to it for some weird reason. It flipped my brain that I was trying to get something out, but I had taken the rest of the week off, and I was going to put the podcast out even during my off time. But then I guess my body and my mind just said, no, you're not going to put out an episode when you're off. So I didn't. And here we are on November 30th, literally 2 years after we put this podcast out. So that's actually kind of fortuitous. But also, I want to let folks know that there will be a new show coming out Thursday, a new episode, and it's likely to be Tony Jordan's episode of the Parking Reform Network. So we talked to him at Impact in Portland, and it was a really fun conversation. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that one. Also, we released some bonus materials on the Patreon, so you can go check that out if you get a chance. We also had a Monday show last week. So there's lots of content. It blew my mind, I just forgot that it was supposed to come out this time. So so this has been Goldfarb, and I hope you enjoy this show. Also, we have some scarves ready to go if you all are interested in them for gifts or for giving out to advocates or whoever else. Go to theoverheadwire.com, email me, theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you want to get some large orders in. Sometimes in the last few years, I've had a couple of orders that are quite big, and so I can get you a discount to send more scarves your way. In any event, so let's get to this episode, and I apologize that it's a couple days late. This month has been really wacky for podcasts, especially since we missed a few weeks because of the Apple stuff that happened. There was a problem with Apple Podcasts. And so, and if you don't listen to the Monday show, but you only listen to this show, I hope that folks go back and download a couple of the episodes that you might have missed because of the Apple Podcast snafu. So over there, there's a couple of downloads that you might have missed. I think episode 180 of the Monday show and the High Speed Rail episode with Roger Rudick. as well as Courtney DeSeer's episode as well. So there's a couple episodes there that you might have missed if you didn't get to them. And then you might have missed this one last Thursday because we didn't put it out. But enough of that. Let's listen to Ben Goldfarb. Ben Goldfarb, welcome to the Talking Kidways podcast.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am an environmental journalist, so I write about wildlife conservation and ecology and public lands management for all kinds of different publications, from The Atlantic to National Geographic to the Smithsonian Magazine. And I'm the author of a couple of books, one about beavers called Eager, and my new book, which we're talking about today, is called Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And I live in Colorado.
So usually I ask folks, because we focus on transportation in cities mostly, I ask them, how did you get into city planning or how did you get into transportation? But how did you get into the work that you do?
Well, let's see. I always loved to write, and I always cared about nature. And, I actually, after college, I had a kind of a series of kind of field ecology tech type of jobs, working for the National Park Service and the New York City Parks Department and, various environmental organizations. And I sort of thought that maybe I was going to do that for a living, be a professional conservationist in some capacity. But I always loved to write. And at some point I remembered that, and I started writing about the things that I was working on and learning about. And eventually that became my whole life. And so, writing about nature is, my experience has been, that's a great way to synthesize my passion and concern for conservation and wildlife with my love of writing.
That's awesome. Well, let's chat about your book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. I found it really easy to read, and I really appreciate that. And I also found it very compelling because of just thinking of it from a transportation perspective, from the roads that are cut through wilderness and non-wilderness everywhere. And you really do discuss how roads carve up the land and have through history. And I'm wondering what started you on this specific journey.
That's a good question. I think that if you write about conservation and wildlife biology as I do, the theme of habitat fragmentation just comes up over and over again. This idea that animals need to move across large landscapes to find food and habitat and mates and all of the things that they need to survive. And, one of the ways in which we've made life incredibly difficult for wild animals is by fragmenting that habitat with our farms and our cities and our infrastructure, and most of all our roads. Roads are sort of the ultimate forces of habitat fragmentation in a lot of ways. So this idea of roads being really problematic for nature just came up over and over again in the work that I was doing. And at some point along the line, I had the opportunity to visit and tour these wildlife crossing structures, these bridges and underpasses that had been built on Highway 93 in Montana for wildlife. And, I just found that incredibly powerful and compelling. I felt like roads had been in the background of everything I was doing. And here was this project that foregrounded them in a way and showed that, this problem of habitat fragmentation, primarily by roads, is not entirely intractable. There are things that we can do to heal some of the ecological wounds that roads create. So it was that experience, seeing these wildlife crossings in Montana, that got me thinking about roads and moved them from background to foreground and started me on the journey of this book.
And it's not a new thing either, it feels like. It's something that's been happening for millennia, the roads cutting through nature, through wild spaces. And I'm curious, if you look back at the history of roads and road building, even going back to the Roman period, how this has impacted the landscape over time. Because now we have obviously the interstate highways and a whole, plethora of road building in places like Brazil, but it goes back to maybe earlier than that.
Much earlier, yeah. I think that one of the ironies of roads is that today there are these forces of the destruction of wild animals, and yet their origins are often as animal trails. Especially in North America, it was these giant herds of bison moving through the landscape, often migrating to salt licks. And, the sort of early accounts from colonists are full of these descriptions of these amazing bison trails where 10 men could walk abreast, that sort of thing. And over time, those bison trails became Native American footpaths that were, used very widely. And there were these extensive corridors of native infrastructure paralleling many of our rivers like the Mississippi and the Columbia. And then, over time, those native footpaths became wagon roads, which were eventually paved and became, sort of country roads for Model Ts, and then eventually became our major federal highways. So, the history of road building is this history of layers of infrastructure built by both wild animals and human users over the course of many centuries. But you're right that, ever since the dawn of road building, roads have had impacts. There are some amazing early kind of proto road ecology studies. You mentioned the Romans showing that, all of those Roman roads and aqueducts were just bleeding sediment into adjacent lakes, which was, profoundly changing the lake's ecosystems. So the impact of roads really predates certainly the automobile, but, obviously cars and traffic dramatically accelerated those impacts and turned roads from, mostly relatively benign structures to these really transformative features of the landscape.
And that's an interesting part as well, is that the evolution of roads themselves almost, outpaced the evolution of the animals that were trying to cross them. And I found that really fascinating too.
Yeah, that's one of the really tragic and I think pernicious things about cars and modern roads that permit really high speeds, right? Is that in some ways, traffic subverts evolution. You sort of imagine the most common defense mechanisms of many of our beloved species. You can picture a turtle withdrawing its limbs into its shell, or a porcupine bristling its quills, or a skunk spraying, or an opossum playing possum, right? These are all evolutionary defense mechanisms that were honed over thousands of generations and worked really well against coyotes and foxes and hawks and natural predators. And then all of a sudden along comes the car, which is this bigger, faster, heavier predator than anything wildlife has ever experienced before. And the worst thing you can do in the face of a car is withdraw into your shell, right? You're going to get crushed. The worst thing you can do is to hunker down. And I think that's a big part of why roadkill is really this epic biological crisis, because it takes these otherwise useful adaptations and not only renders them useless, but actually renders them maladaptive, which I've always found really tragic.
There's also another evolutionary issue, which is the cutting off of ecosystems from other ecosystems by roads. And that was another piece of the book that really, I don't know if it made me sad so much as like disappointed, because of the impact that we've had on, evolution of animals overall, or their migration patterns, or whatever it might be. But just like the way that we've impacted them, maybe more than they've impacted us.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That kind of genetic fragmentation is really, that's really deleterious, and the loss of migration pathways is something I think about a lot, right? With the kind of the direct mortality caused by roads, right? Roadkill, it's this very conspicuous manifestation of the problems that cars create. We've all seen the dead deer or raccoon or squirrel by the side of the highway. It's this very visible demonstration of how damaging roads can be. But what you don't really see are the animals that never even attempt to cross roads, because there's this steady stream of traffic whizzing by, this phenomenon that some biologists have called the moving fence. Again, this impermeable wall of traffic. And, that's even worse, I think, in some cases than roadkill itself. In the book, I tell the story of this herd of mule deer in Wyoming that can't reach their winter habitat because, I-80 gets in their way. And they don't even really attempt to cross I-80. In some years, many of them starve as a result. And, and I think, again, that's worse than roadkill. A herd of mule deer or antelope or elk or what have you, they can probably survive a few collisions on the highway. What they can't survive is starving en masse because, they've lost access to really important habitat. So, a road itself might only be 100 feet from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's depriving wild animals of access to potentially hundreds of thousands of acres of land.
That's another part that I found inspiring as well, is the amount of space that animals take up and need to propagate their species as well as survive. Going from one part of North America to another part of North America seems like a long trip for us, obviously, but for some animals, it's like their whole habitat. And so we might place them in our minds as being in a certain place, a mule deer maybe in southern Utah or something along those lines, but they actually go very far north and very far south. Or the butterflies, for example, that you talk about, the monarch, how they have 3 different life cycles to get from one place to another. And so one monarch might not even see the other 2 migration areas, but it's part of their journey as a species. And so that whole needed space that we kind of don't think about as much is really compelling as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point that, that animals are moving constantly at all kinds of different scales, right? There are these migrations, you mentioned the monarch butterfly, those migrations span the continent, right? Those animals are going from Mexico to Minnesota, covering hundreds and hundreds of miles. And then, you might get frogs or salamanders, which are migrating seasonally, but they're only going a quarter mile from their kind of upland forest habitat to their breeding ponds. And yet, that quarter mile was likely bisected by a road, because we tend to build our roads, close to water where the topography is flat and the building is relatively easy. So, animals are moving all the time at all of these different scales. And those are just migrations. Animals also move in their daily lives, especially larger carnivores like mountain lions and grizzly bears. Those are species whose home ranges might encompass hundreds of square miles. It's pretty hard to have a home range of a couple hundred square miles that's not bisected by a highway in this country, where highways are ubiquitous. So for every different species, whether it's monarchs migrating across the continent, or salamanders trudging a few hundred feet from pond to forest, or a mountain lion circling his territory once a week, in search of mates or prey, animals are moving all of the time. And I think that's why roads again are so pernicious. They've made our lives freer and more mobile in a lot of ways, even as they've done the exact opposite to wild animals. They truncate all of these movements and journeys.
How important are deer to this discussion? Thinking about how roads have spread out across the United States in the last, 50 to 150 years, I'm curious how deer have kind of changed the discussion.
Yeah, I think that, really starting in the 1950s and early 60s, deer really made the intersection of roads and wildlife this prominent national issue, right? It's interesting to go back in some of the early roadkill studies, which started in the 1920s, and all of these biologists are sort of driving around in their Packards and Model Ts, and they're counting ground squirrels and woodpeckers and garter snakes, all of these different species, but none of those early wildlife biologists ever document any white-tailed deer. And the reason is that there just weren't really many deer to be hit at that point. We think of deer as these incredibly ubiquitous animals, but we hunted them almost to extinction by the end of the 19th century. So in sort of the first half of the 20th century, there really weren't many deer on the landscape. But by the 1950s, deer populations are recovering, and that really coincides with the construction of the interstate highway system. So we've got these giant new highways. Americans are driving farther and faster than ever before, and suddenly there's this big, relatively common 150-pound mammal blundering into their way and crossing highways and causing all of these really dangerous collisions. And today deer are the most dangerous wild animal in the country, responsible for between 200 and 400 driver deaths every year, and in deer vehicle collisions. Of course, it's not the deer's fault, right? It's the car, obviously, that has made the deer so dangerous. But it is interesting to think that in the early 1900s, back when people were only hitting snakes and squirrels and turtles, road ecology, this discipline that studies how roads and nature interact, really was kind of the fringe concern of a few naturalists who were considered a little bit kooky. And then once deer proliferate and driver safety becomes a big problem, suddenly all of these wildlife biologists and transportation departments are suddenly concerned. So the issue, wasn't necessarily how cars endangered wildlife, it was how wildlife endangered cars, somewhat perversely. But certainly this field of road ecology wouldn't be nearly as robust as it is today, if it weren't for the recovery of white-tailed deer and all of the deer vehicle collisions that ensued.
So then this leads to some sorts of solutions and trial and errors and figuring out ways to keep the deer from maybe crossing when they still wanted to cross.
That's exactly right. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you see all of these solutions being tried. I mean, of course, the deer sign, right? That's the first thing that every transportation department sort of falls back on, the classic yellow diamond with the leaping black silhouette of the buck. And those are totally useless, right? And there's, plenty of research showing that, the drivers just habituate to those things and ignore them. Nobody slows down when they see a deer crossing sign. They're basically visual pollution at this point, right? So most of the early strategies like signs and reflectors and deer whistles, those all of that stuff doesn't really work. But by the 1970s, transportation departments in states like Wyoming and Colorado and Utah start building these wildlife crossings that we were talking about earlier, these passageways, mostly for deer and elk and antelope and other kind of migratory species of big game that's moving around the American West. And that over time, really becomes clear that that's the most effective solution to this problem of wildlife vehicle collisions and the loss of these migration routes. If you give animals a chance to cross the road separated from the surface of the highway itself, they take advantage of those opportunities. And, roadside fences are a big part of that as well. The fences guide the animals to the crossings and then they go through. And in a lot of ways, that's been a lot of what road ecologists have done for the last, 40 or 50 years, is figure out, how to build those things better and where to put them and, what species they work for and so on. So today, that wildlife crossing that's really the best tool in our toolbox for dealing with the problems that roads create, or at least some of the problems.
They cost a fair amount of money. And the other thing that was important was trying to do the math so that highway agencies would care about them. Because, thinking about how much money they cost, they're going to have to figure out how to offset that cost by saying, well, we're going to save this many human lives and we're going to save this many car fenders and do the math to do the calculations. But ultimately, it doesn't seem like it's always necessarily a positive thought for the animals. It's more like, what can we do for ourselves? That's how I took it anyways in reading the book.
I think you're exactly right about that. And that is the great thing about, a lot of these wildlife crossings, right? Is that they do tend to pay for themselves. Today the average deer vehicle collision costs society more than $9,000 in vehicle repairs and hospital bills and tow trucks and insurance costs and so on, right? So these are really, these really expensive incidents. And if you can build a structure that, prevents, let's say 50 of them a year, some of these wildlife crossings have done, those structures pay for themselves really, really quickly. So, there's often some initial sticker shock when, you say, wait a second, we're going to spend, $5 million on helping elk cross a highway. That seems kind of crazy. And then, you realize that, oh yeah, these structures are actually pretty thrifty in a sense. But, I think you're right that, our focus on cost savings and prevention of dangerous crashes, has been somewhat myopic, I would say, because there are lots of animals out there, like frogs and turtles and all those reptiles and amphibians, especially, that are some of the most road endangered animals on the planet. And yet, nobody's ever totaled their car hitting a spotted salamander, right? So we tend not to build crossings for those animals. The history of wildlife crossings, I think, is definitely focused on mitigating for those large, dangerous animals that threaten us. And at least here in the US, I think we've mostly ignored the smaller critters for which roadkill might be a conservation crisis, but, is not a public safety problem.
Yeah, and that doesn't get as much money.
Right.
You went on a lot of field trips for this book, it felt like. Which one impacted you the most?
That's a good question. The one that I always think about is going to Tasmania, which is the roadkill capital of the world that has, some of the highest roadkill rates ever recorded. And, anecdotally, it's inescapable, how many dead wallabies and wombats and possums and all kinds of different marsupials are, dead on the road. And, what's fascinating about Tasmania, and this is true of a lot of Australia, is that the animals are, they tend to be marsupials, right? I mean, they're basically all marsupials, which means that they raise their offspring in a pouch. And what happens frequently is that female marsupials will get hit by cars and they'll die, but their joeys, their babies, will actually survive in the pouch. And so there are, hundreds of wildlife rehabilitators, which in Australia are known as carers, who just drive around the countryside looking for dead female marsupials and then extracting the babies within their pouches and then raising those babies to adulthood, which, in some cases can take years, pretty incredibly. And, I just find that fascinating because, here in the US, I think that roadkill tends to be mostly invisible to us, right? We see so much of it, we kind of inure ourselves to it or sort of desensitize to it in a lot of ways. It's just stuff that we've all driven by all of those carcasses, and almost as an act of self-preservation, I think we kind of blind ourselves to them. Whereas in Tasmania, there are literally hundreds of people driving around out there looking for roadkill for the sake of saving some of the orphaned animals that are created in the process. So I just found that really inspiring. It suggested a kind of a different relationship with roads and nature, one in which humans are capable of paying heed to the problems that roads cause, and in some small way attempting to almost pay reparations for those problems. And certainly, I mean, that system of all of these wildlife carers driving around picking up marsupials and raising them to adulthood, it's heartwarming. It's not probably the most effective thing in the world, because then you're just you're raising animals to adulthood and then you're releasing them into the exact same dangerous environment that orphaned them in the first place, right? It'd certainly be much better if Tasmania invested heavily in wildlife crossings and other ways of preventing the roadkill in the first place. So I don't want to be too warm and fuzzy about this policy, but again, I was just inspired by how people pay attention to roadkill there in a way that they really don't here in the U.S.
There seemed to be a large number of roadkill, obviously, but they weren't as worried about it because they felt like there were so many animals out there, which is a little bit of a disturbing thought to a certain extent.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, I think that's true, right? That the animals that we hit tend to be common ones. And so if you see a lot of roadkill, it suggests that there are probably a lot of animals on the landscape, which is a big part of why Tasmania has so much roadkill, because it's just, a very abundant and biodiverse place. So yeah, there is something a little bit perverse in that, I think. And and I think that's another reason that we we don't really think much about roadkill, because the animals that we tend to see here in the US as well are the common ones, right? Again, the gray squirrels and the raccoons and the white-tailed deer, all of the animals that are ubiquitous and for which roadkill probably isn't a real existential threat, right? And so it's easy to conclude that roadkill is not a conservation crisis because the animals we see are common. But for lots of rare and endangered species, like ocelots or Florida panthers or Tasmanian devils in Tasmania, for those rarer species as well, roadkill is truly an existential threat. And because they're rare, we tend not to see those animals hit very often, and just aren't many of them out there. You think about ocelots in Texas, for example. I mean, there are only 100 ocelots left, and 40% of them are killed by cars, and that's a population for which traffic really is literally driving them to extinction.
Yeah, I think about the anteater as well. I was reading the book and I saw the number of anteaters that they said were killed, and it was like 600, 800 or something along those lines. And I was like, well, how many are there left? And it's like 5,000. It's like, that's a huge percentage of their numbers. And the fact is made worse by the amount of time it takes to have offspring and how much care goes into, like a year of care. And so if you killed a female who hadn't had any kids yet, that just like totally chopped off one of the family tree limbs that could have actually grown the species, but now it's gone.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's true of lots of species, like the grizzly bears, for example, have the same kind of life history where they invest a lot of time and effort in raising their cubs. And so, if you invest all of that time and effort, and then an important breeding female is killed or the cubs themselves are killed, it's certainly it's a catastrophe, and it's very easy, I think, to, concoct these scenarios where, the loss of really just a few important mature breeding females it really spells disaster for the entire population. I mean, that just happened in Iran, actually, just a few months ago. There are these cats, the Asiatic cheetah, which live in Iran, and I forget the name of one of these female cheetahs. There are so few of them, just a couple dozen, that they actually they're all named at this point. And and a female pregnant female was killed by a car, and that was considered one of the potential death knells for that entire species.
That can help too, right? Because when you talk about things like the P22 cougar in Southern California, there was a popularity to it. They were able to attach celebrity to it to get funds raised for wildlife crossing and everything else. I mean, there's some benefit to that celebrity, although there is a negative aspect as well, because the reason why P22 was over there was because it got stuck in the freeway mass of Southern California.
Yeah, exactly. And, yeah, and P-22 is probably the most, at least before his death by car, he's probably the most famous wild animal in America, if not the world, and he was this cougar living near Los Angeles who, somehow managed to cross a couple of the giant freeways, the 101 and the 405. And then he ended up, trapped in this little urban park, Griffith Park, stuck. He had the smallest home range of any cougar in the world because he was just, again, trapped in this little island of habitat surrounded by freeways. And, he really, in some ways, that whole population of cougars that live near Los Angeles, that P-22 became the mascot for, they are some of the poster animals, I think, for the damage that roads do. They're trapped on, again, this little island of habitat in the Santa Monica Mountains, surrounded by freeways. And they've become incredibly inbred as a result, because no new cats can cross the 101 to enter the population and, refresh the gene pool. So those cougars are stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great granddaughters, and they've become very inbred, and they're suffering all of these genetic defects, and they would be basically doomed were it not for this giant wildlife crossing that's being built over the 101 to connect them with cougar populations elsewhere in California. So yeah, they're certainly the poster animals for this problem, and P-22 became this amazing symbol of what these cats are up against. And I think you're absolutely right that were it not for P-22's celebrity, that wildlife crossing wouldn't be getting built right now.
There's a thread of thinking from some in American life that favors man over nature or man conquering nature. Like, we've conquered this space. We are allowed to build roads wherever we want to. We can do whatever we want. Damn the environmental impact statements or whatever. If I want to build a road through a national forest, then I'm going to build a road through a national forest. And I'm wondering, like, how we think of that specific feeling that some have with regards to, like, all the information that you share in your book related to the gene pool splicing, the problems with, migration patterns, the issues with smaller animals, being at the end of their species. Just like that kind of weighing of one type of person who just feels like none of that matters. It's all about human advancement.
Yeah, I think it's a really good and complex question, and I'm just trying to, I'm just feel like there's so many directions you could take it. I think in a very real sense, the history of road construction in the United States is a history of conquest, right? I mean, these were the structures that we built, all these early wagon roads, many of which were built by the US Army to open up the interior of the continent to, agriculture and logging and, certainly bison hunting. And roads were really how we invaded Native American lands and attempted to conquer those many tribes. And, roads became, again, these tools of imperialism and colonialism. And, that's also their relationship with nature, right? Again, that these are the structures that we use to bend nature to our will. In some ways, as I put it in the book, they're the roots of all environmental evil, ROUTES, right? That, before you can log the Amazon, you need the roads to get the machinery in and the logs out, right? That's true of, oil and gas drilling and mining and every conceivable ecological impact is, it all begins with road building. So you're right that they are the kind of the tendrils that we extend into nature in order to dominate and subjugate our landscapes. And I think that that's always how we've perceived them in a very real way, especially as roads became better over time. It's interesting to read about the early history of roads, and they were kind of subject to the elements. They would turn into, these muddy ruts in the spring, and there'd be blowing dust in the summer, and they'd become these icy slicks in the winter. And so travel was really constrained. But over time, as we got better and better at road building, they really became decoupled from the elements in many cases and were no longer part of nature, but again, sort of subjugated it in an interesting and, ultimately ecologically catastrophic way. And so, yeah, I agree with you that if we're going to rethink our relationship with nature and with infrastructure, we have to not only conduct a lot of research about how best to blunt the environmental harms of roads, but we also have to kind of reconfigure our own imaginations in some ways, and really rethink what these structures mean and symbolize. And I mean, I mentioned earlier that my journey in this field really began 10 years ago with seeing these wildlife crossings on Highway 93 in Montana. And those crossings are on the reservation of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And those crossings were built because the tribes basically had this concept, this really beautiful idea that roads should be visitors to the land rather than conquerors of the land. And I think that notion, how can we make our roads lighter and more benign, and again, visitors rather than rulers of ecosystems? I think there's a lot of truth and beauty in that concept.
It's also interesting in light of our discussion about infrastructure to save the planet, right? Because we're having this big national conversation about how permitting should happen so that we can build more power lines and we can build more things that can connect maybe renewable energy to places where it needs to go. And so I find that fascinating too, connect all those dots where we're saying like, well, we need, NEPA and environmental permitting for thinking about these larger impacts, but then maybe we should push it aside for, building these things faster because we can't seem to build things fast anymore.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it is interesting to think about this issue of roads' impacts on nature, and really reflect on how historically the environmental movement is one that opposes construction, right? And now all of these different environmental organizations are they're very much in favor of building these wildlife crossings, culvert retrofits. There are billions of dollars in 2021 Federal Infrastructure Act for nature friendly, or at least nature friendlier infrastructure. So I find that trajectory fascinating. That at one time the environmental movement was again one that tried to prevent things from getting built, but so many of those structures, be it roads or dams or power lines, got built regardless. And now, we're sort of saddled with this infrastructure, and the movement has really turned to retrofitting it and rebuilding it. And okay, if we're stuck with all of this asphalt, how can we tweak it? And that's, and there were times working on this book where, I almost felt like a defeatist in advocating for more wildlife crossings, because because you're essentially accepting the permanence of the road and the tyranny of the car as a given, a permanent given. And the best that we can do is sort of retrofit this infrastructure to make it less catastrophic for nature. But I think there's unfortunately there's truth to the fact that we're sort of stuck with the car in a very real way. And certainly there are lots of things that we can do, and that your listeners are doing to make our lives less car dependent and to promote other forms of mobility. And those are all wonderful, but it's just hard to imagine a future that's car free altogether. I think we're largely stuck, with especially our interstate highways. And if we are, then it's incumbent upon us, to again retrofit them to make them less catastrophic.
You did have some really good examples in the book. In Alaska, just deciding not to go with a bus every 10 minutes or so, just because, that messes up the ecology from the noise pollution. The noise pollution impacts were really interesting to me as well, all over the country, thinking about how noise, it's not just the vehicles hitting animals or killing animals, it's actually the noise that impacts how they live their lives as well. And so, in Alaska, there's a solution. Don't have the buses go every 5 minutes. It can go every 10 minutes. And, people might not be happy about not being able to make money off that 5-minute headway bus, but it actually is beneficial over time.
Yeah, I love that example. That that's in Denali National Park, where decades ago the park made the decision to prohibit the vast majority of private cars from the vast majority of the park's main road, and sort of forced visitors onto buses, which not everybody liked at first, but certainly has just done wonders, I think, for reducing the impact of the road and traffic on the park. And now, as you say, the buses are, at least in theory, spaced in intervals that provide animals the ability to migrate between them. So there's not this steady stream of buses and shuttles. There are these nice long interregnums where wildlife can move around. So yeah, to me, that's a really inspiring example. As one of park biologists put it to me, where how many roads in the United States can say that they have, the same amount of traffic today as they had in the early 1980s, right? It's almost heretical. We have this idea that we're supposed to, be able to drive everywhere and go everywhere and get around as fast as we want. And, here was this place that sort of deliberately froze its traffic, for the sake of nature. And there's certainly something, really beautiful and inspiring in that. And that's a model that can be replicated in so many of our national parks and forests, right? Especially parks, these are areas that were set aside, largely to protect nature, but because the Park Service wanted and still wants people to experience these beloved landscapes like Yosemite and Yellowstone, we have these very automotive tourism models, where literally millions of cars enter these sacred natural places every year and are destroying these ecosystems. And there's, to me, a fascinating tension there, that looked at roads and cars dramatically increased the constituency for protecting these places. How many Americans fell in love with nature, thanks to road trips bopping around our national parks, right? It's sort of this quintessential way of experiencing our landscape. And yet again, our automotive approach to tourism was destroying those very same places, right? So to me, Denali presents this alternative model, this opportunity for visitors to experience these incredible landscapes and the wildlife that inhabits them without letting cars just totally run amok in a protected area.
I was just at Zion last week and rode the buses there, and obviously
Nice.
on a section of it they allow e-bikes now, which is I'm wondering about the e-bikes and like the impact of that, because I don't think you mentioned that in the book, but there's a lot of e-bikes in addition to the buses going down to all the places where you can hike. But every 5 minutes there's a bus, and you saw a number of mule deer and a number of animals hanging out, not necessarily close to the road. But I wish I had read your book before I got to the park, because then I would have listened, right? I would have listened for what was there and what wasn't there, because I feel like the tire sounds that we're so used to are so ubiquitous that sometimes we don't even think to listen to see if they're there or not.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that road noise is really one of the great unsung ecological and public health crises of our time. Road noise pollution is truly a form of habitat loss, that we don't really think about, when you have, all of this engine and tire noise bleeding into the surrounding landscape. That's driving animals away from places they'd otherwise like to live. Of course, all wildlife kind of relies on their hearing, whether it's, an owl listening for the rustle of a mouse's feet in the leaf litter, or, a songbird singing to attract a mate. That the ability to hear is fundamental to life. And if you can't hear because, road noise pollution masks all of those subtle acoustic signals, you can't live in a place. And, I think that road noise does something similar to us humans. It is really, again, a public health crisis. You look at the literature and it's just horrifying. Road noise pollution is elevating our stress levels and our blood pressures, and it's making us more susceptible to heart disease and stroke and diabetes. And there's one just horrifying study that was set in Paris that found that, that Parisians living in the quietest neighborhoods lived 3 years longer than Parisians living in the noisiest neighborhoods. So, road noise is literally taking years off of our lives. So I think you're right that we're so constantly exposed to it and awash in it that we don't really notice it, even as it's dramatically affecting us.
I ask this question from time to time, and I really like it because I think it kind of gives a focus on your journey. I'm wondering if there's a question that you've probably been on a lot of press tours and talked to a lot of folks about your book, but is there a question that you wish you were asked more?
That's a good question, Jeff. I don't know. I love some of your probing questions about, roads as conquerors of nature.
I guess I could reframe it too as like, is there something that you talk about in the book that you feel doesn't get enough attention?
Yeah. I think that one thing I actually wish I'd written about more in the book is, the electrification of our car fleet. This is certainly like reflected in, in Biden administration policy and rhetoric. I think when we think about the environmental impact of transportation, we think about the carbon footprint, right? All of that internal combustion, releasing greenhouse gases. And, certainly that's a huge problem, but it's only one of many problems that roads and traffic create. And electrifying our fleet is not going to do anything for, that barrier effect that highways create for animal migrations or roadkill. I mean, even road noise, yes, of course, there won't be engine noise, but, tire noise is actually the kind of the dominant form of road noise pollution at highway speeds. So, you can't just take the carbon out of traditional automotive transportation and suddenly make it ecologically benign. And, at times I wish I'd made that point more strongly in the book and really emphasized that. And, it's also easy to concoct scenarios where electrification makes all of these problems worse, in that we know Javon's paradox, right? That when behavior is cheaper, we do it more. And if all you're doing is plugging your car into the house rather than, filling up the gas tank at $5 a gallon, you're going to drive more. And again, there's lots of modeling suggesting that the dual forces of electrification and autonomy are going to increase vehicle miles traveled. And that's going to make this whole situation a lot worse for wild animals. So I wish that I had sort of come out more strongly, and I don't want to say that I'm anti-electrification, but I just wish that I had emphasized the idea that you can't just take the carbon out and assume that you've made car-based transportation benign.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on the show, the weight of these new vehicles because of the amount of batteries that are needed to go the distances that people expect their vehicles to go. And obviously you mentioned in the book the discussion about the tire wear and how much the rubber and the chemicals have been known to kill fish and things like that. So we have all of these understandings about how cars impact nature and the environment overall, but then you add on top of that the discussion that you have about crossings and wildlife ecosystems more generally, the sprawl that's generated, etc. Just, it's funny because I read the book and I love it because I found that it brought me something new, a new perspective and something very interesting. But at the same time, I feel like lately a lot of the stuff that I've been reading has been making me like, not sad, but just reflective on how we've kind of built society overall and, what that means. And, if humans don't even have a chance against cars, 40,000 people are killed every year on the roads. What chance do animals have? And it's disconcerting, but also necessary to understand.
Yeah. I think, Jeff, probably like you and, probably like a lot of people who work on transportation and urban planning, I kind of oscillate wildly, I think, between hope and despair,
Yes,
because, look, I mean, I feel hopeful because, there are so many smart people working on these issues, right? And there are lots of fantastic case studies of cities that have managed to reduce the impacts of cars on their urban core and, and transportation departments that have built these wildlife crossings that have, incredible success rates. And we've successfully addressed these problems at localized scales in various places all over the country. And, and that's hopeful and inspiring. But, then you look at the macro view and it's hard to feel good about where we're going. I mean, this planet's going to have 15 more miles of paved road, at least by the middle of this century, right? We're building roads rapidly. We're heading to a world of 2 billion cars pretty rapidly, and meanwhile, we're in the middle of this catastrophic mass extinction event and biodiversity crisis, which cars are an enormous contributor to. And again, vehicle miles traveled generally are going in the wrong direction. So it's definitely this kind of weird back and forth again between feeling like, yes, there are great smart people working on this issue and there are lots of good case studies we can point to, but again, the sort of the large scale trends are, I think, mostly negative.
Yeah. Well, on a positive note, there's some roads in national parks around the world that are curved and undulating and don't cause a lot of speeding, which means that animals can be safer. There's also a lot of wildlife crossings and really cool stuff going on too that helps the salmon and the salamanders and the turtles and everything else. So thanks for bringing those to light. The book is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. Where can folks get a copy if they want one? Or actually, where can folks get a copy because they should go get one?
Yeah, not because they want one, because they need one.
Yeah.
It's available anywhere that books are sold, I hope. You certainly your local independent bookstore is always a great place to buy and request books. And any online retailer also carries it. So, I so hope that listeners pick it up and read it and learn from it. And, like you said, Jeff, I mean, I'd like to imagine that it brings these sort of alternative perspectives about the impact of roads on nature to into larger conversations about planning and mobility, while also demonstrating that, look, we're all in this together, and that many of the ways that roads and traffic and cars negatively impact human lives, they do the same thing to wild animals. The same road noise pollution that chases songbirds out of their habitat, is also harming our own existences. And, the same freeways that fragment ecosystems are fragmenting human neighborhoods and communities. And as you say, 40,000 people are killed in car crashes every year, just as, more than 1 million animals are killed every day by cars. So, both humans and wild animals are in it together. And I'd like to imagine that listeners will find a lot of the parallels that I mentioned in the book interesting.
Well, there's so much more in the book that we didn't get to talk about, so you should definitely go pick it up. Park roads, salmon ladders, all kinds of really interesting things in there. Turtles, butterflies, all the things can make you happy. We have a segment on one of our shows called Puppies and Butterflies. We talk about happy stuff. There's lots of that in here, so I appreciate that. Ben, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks for the great questions.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting TheOverheadWire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, thanks for listening this far past the credits. If you're here, I just want to say thank you to all of our generous Patreon supporters, especially those in our $10 Dallas tier and above. I just want to share their names, first names only, of course, but I figured this is long overdue that I let folks know that their support is much appreciative. Obviously, all the tiers are very appreciative, but this group has gone above and beyond over the years, and I really appreciate that. Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Oliver, Steve, Abraham, Abby, Ed, and Matthew. We really appreciate you, and just can't say enough about how much the support from you all and everybody else on Patreon has really helped us out. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody, and yeah, so we'll see you next time.